Most people believe time is something outside themselves, a force that moves steadily forward, carrying life with it. But time, as we experience it, is largely a psychological construction, a story the ego tells to preserve itself. The universe does not move from past to future in the way the human mind imagines. It is only the ego that divides reality into what was, what is, and what might be. And in doing so, it creates an inner tension that dominates our entire lives. In this episode, we will explore how the ego uses time to maintain its identity, how it clings to memories and expectations as proof of its existence, and how liberation begins the moment you see that time, in the way you experience it, is an illusion. The ego cannot survive without time. To know itself, it must constantly refer to what has happened before. It relies on memory to construct a sense of continuity, a belief that the you who woke up this morning is the same you who went to sleep last night. But look closely, and you'll see that memory is not stable. It is fluid, selective, rewritten constantly. Yet the ego treats it as sacred, as proof of a fixed identity. Likewise, the future becomes a canvas onto which the ego projects its desires, fears, ambitions, and anxieties. The ego needs a future to chase, because without a future, it has no direction. And without a direction, it feels meaningless. This is why many people feel anxious when they try to sit still. For a brief moment, the ego loses its anchor points. It cannot find the past, it cannot find the future, it cannot find a story to hold on to. And without a story, the ego feels like it is dying. The fear you feel in stillness is not your fear. It is the ego's fear of disappearing. To the ego, the past is not simply memory. It is identity. Every hurt, every success, every regret, every moment of praise or humiliation becomes a brick in the walls the ego builds around itself. This archive of selective memories becomes the story of who I am. But the past is not real in the way the ego imagines. It does not exist anywhere except as a thought in the present moment. Try to touch it. Try to hold it. Try to return to it. You cannot. The past is a shadow of what once was not a place, but a psychological film that the ego replays to reinforce its sense of continuity. Some cling to a past that was painful, not because they enjoy the suffering, but because even pain is familiar, and the ego prefers familiarity to uncertainty. Others cling to a past that was pleasant, living in nostalgia, because the present feels insufficient. But nostalgia is just as imprisoning as trauma. Both bind you to a version of yourself that no longer exists. The ego's use of the past is not to remember, but to preserve itself. The future is the ego's playground. It is where it builds castles of hope and towers of fear. It is where it imagines the perfect version of itself. The more successful self, the more enlightened self, the more admired self. The ego is always running toward a promised land, never noticing that the promised land is forever one step away. The ego cannot allow you to arrive because arrival destroys its purpose. If you were ever truly satisfied, fully at ease in the present, the ego would lose its leverage. So it projects goals, dreams, illusions, nightmares, and expectations into the future to keep you moving. But the future does not exist. It is a mental blueprint, no more real than the past. The ego's obsession with what might come is its way of avoiding what is here. The present is dangerous to the ego because it cannot control it. In the present moment, there is no story, no achievement, no identity, only raw experience, pure being. And the ego has no role in pure being. The ego cannot live in the present because the present has no boundaries, no definitions, no separations. The present moment is spacious, open, fluid, and the ego is rigid, tight, defined. So the ego pulls you away from presence. by dragging you into memory or pushing you into anticipation. This constant movement between past and future creates psychological time, the illusion of a separate self moving through life. But life is not a journey through time. Life is a continuous unfolding now. The ego uses time for three purposes. 1. Continuity. It needs a past to believe it exists. 2. Direction. It needs a future to feel purposeful. 3. Avoidance. It uses both past and future to avoid the raw simplicity of the present. Much of human suffering arises from this. Regret lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. Fear lives in anticipation. Shame lives in memory. But your true self, your awareness, lives only in the present. The ego's use of time disconnects you from the only place where life actually happens. When the ego becomes the master of time, you become the slave of psychological time. We imagine time as a straight line, past, present, future. But this is a mental map, not reality. Reality is not linear. Reality is simultaneous. Every moment arises fresh, spontaneously, without reference to a past or a future, except in thought. The idea of a linear timeline is a conceptual convenience, not an existential truth. Quantum physics suggests a deeper truth. Time is not absolute. It is flexible, subjective, shaped by perception. But you do not need physics to experience this directly. Watch your breath. Watch your thoughts. Watch the movement of sensation. Where do they begin? Where do they end? Each moment appears from nowhere and disappears into nowhere. Life is not a line. It is a dance of arising and dissolving. The ego is obsessed with the idea of becoming successful, becoming spiritual, becoming enlightened, becoming worthy, becoming complete. But becoming is always in the future, and the future is always an illusion. The ego cannot tolerate the idea that you are already complete, because that would end its purpose. So it creates a never-ending journey toward a horizon that keeps receding. But enlightenment is not something you become. It is something you recognize. And what you recognize is that there is no separate self who needs to become anything at all. When you observe the ego's use of time, you begin to see that your entire life has been shaped by a story of who you believe you were and who you believe you must become. But this story is not truth. It is a narrative created by thought. When you let go of the story, you do not disappear. You return to the present. You return to awareness, to the state you were in as a child before the ego learned to divide time and carve boundaries into experience. Letting go is not losing identity. It is losing illusion. Freedom does not come from controlling time. It comes from seeing that time is a mental construction. The present moment is always complete, always whole, always enough. When you live in presence, you are no longer haunted by the past or chased by the future. You still remember. You still plan. But memory and planning no longer define you. They become tools, not prisons. In presence, life becomes light, effortless, flowing, alive. This is the freedom beyond the ego's illusion of time. When you begin to see through the boundaries of the ego, the world doesn't suddenly transform into a realm of easy answers. Instead, something more subtle occurs. You gain the ability to notice the architecture of your inner world with unprecedented clarity. You start to observe patterns that once operated invisibly, shaping your thoughts, moods, and choices. And among all these patterns, one stands out as the most deeply rooted, the labyrinth of egoic perception. The labyrinth is not built of walls, but of assumptions. Assumptions about yourself, assumptions about others, assumptions about the nature of life. These assumptions create winding paths that lead you away from the simplicity of direct experience and into a maze of abstractions, interpretations, and psychological complexities. You do not wander this labyrinth deliberately. You drift into it guided by old fears, unresolved emotions, and unconscious habits. But once the boundaries of the ego soften, you begin to see the structure of this labyrinth. You notice the turns you habitually take, the emotional loops you fall into, the stories you repeat in different disguises. You realize that the labyrinth is not a fixed entity, it is made of your own perception. And because it is woven from perception, it can also be unwoven. As awareness deepens, you start to notice the movement of thought without identifying with the thinker. This is one of the most profound shifts on the path beyond ego. The mind continues to produce thoughts, feelings, and reactions, but you are no longer entangled in their momentum. Instead of feeling like the controller of the mind, you witness the mind moving naturally, like water flowing in a stream. The ego insists that it is the author of thought, the initiator of intention, the commander of action. But when you look closely, this belief begins to dissolve. You see that thoughts arise spontaneously, without your permission. Emotions appear without warning. The body breathes without your involvement. Awareness perceives without effort. And you begin to question a fundamental assumption. If thoughts arise on their own, who exactly is the one claiming ownership of them? This question does not require an intellectual answer. Simply holding it gently loosens the grip of the ego. You discover that internal phenomena do not need a controller. They unfold naturally when allowed to move without interference. A remarkable realization emerges. The ego is not a solid, enduring thing. It is not a self, nor a soul, nor an inner commander. Instead, it is a habit, a pattern of perception reinforced through years of conditioning. This habit manifests as the impulse to defend your self-image, the urge to prove something, the fear of judgment, the need for control, the tendency to narrate experience rather than live it. These impulses arise automatically because they have been rehearsed countless times. The ego is a reflex, not a ruler. Understanding this frees you from the need to destroy the ego or wage war against it. Habits dissolve not through force, but through awareness. When you see the ego operating in real time, its power diminishes. You no longer mistake the pattern for your identity. The sense of self that the ego constructs is deeply tied to memory. You identify with an accumulation of past experiences, holding on to them as proof of who you are. Yet this identity comes at a cost. It creates a heaviness, a psychological weight that you carry everywhere you go. This weight is made of unresolved emotions, outdated beliefs, internalized expectations, imagined futures, regrets and nostalgia, roles and responsibilities. The ego uses these pieces of psychological content to reinforce its boundaries. It convinces you that all of this content is you. But when you see that identity is a constantly shifting narrative, the weight begins to lift. You realize that you are not defined by memory, but by awareness, the capacity in which all experience arises. Suddenly, inner space opens, and in that space, clarity emerges. Life is not a static phenomenon. It is a continual unfolding, a river of becoming that flows with or without your participation. The ego resists this flow by clinging to identity, certainty, and permanence. It tries to freeze the river, to create stability where none exists. But the river moves anyway. Every moment is new. Every breath is unprecedented. You are constantly being rewritten by life, reshaped by experience, renewed by awareness. When you stop resisting this flow, the river becomes a source of freedom rather than fear. You begin to sense the natural rhythm of existence, the ebb and flow, the rise and fall, the endless transformation. In this flow, identity becomes fluid. You are not a fixed being, but an evolving expression of life. The ego's need for control dissolves in the recognition that life is not something you possess, it is something you participate in. Resistance is the ego's primary strategy for navigating reality. It resists discomfort, uncertainty, change, and vulnerability. It resists anything that challenges its sense of autonomy. But resistance generates tension. It creates psychological friction, grinding the gears of consciousness and exhausting your energy. As you become more aware of resistance, you begin to see alternatives. You realize that you can meet experience with softness rather than struggle. You can accept uncertainty instead of fearing it. You can allow emotions to move instead of suppressing them. You can open to life rather than protect yourself from it. This softening does not mean passivity. It is an intelligent, adaptive responsiveness that arises from clarity rather than fear. It is the capacity to move with life rather than against it. At the base of the ego lies fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of insignificance, fear of death. These fears are not eliminated through intellectual reasoning. They dissolve when seen clearly. Fear operates in the shadows of consciousness. It thrives on avoidance, denial, and distraction. But when fear is brought into awareness gently, without judgment, it loses its ability to dominate. You begin to see the origins of fear, the stories that sustain it, and the illusions that magnify it. Most fears are not about life, but about the ego's survival. The ego fears the unknown because it cannot control it. It fears change because it threatens identity. It fears silence because silence reveals the emptiness of its narratives. But awareness is larger than fear. When you rest in awareness, fear becomes a wave in the ocean, rising and falling without defining the whole. When the ego dominates, the mind becomes a battlefield. Thoughts clash, emotions collide, judgments sting, and inner conflict becomes constant. You feel divided within yourself, torn between competing impulses, desires, and expectations. This inner division creates suffering. But as awareness expands, the internal enemy begins to disappear. You realize that inner conflict arises from misidentification, from believing that opposing thoughts and emotions belong to different selves within you. In truth, they are simply movements of consciousness. When you stop identifying with the content of consciousness, conflict loses its fuel. Thoughts no longer need to defeat each other. Emotions no longer need to be suppressed or justified. Experience becomes unified, a single, continuous flow rather than a battle between factions. Freedom, in the ego's view, is the ability to control circumstances, assert dominance, and avoid discomfort. But this form of freedom is fragile, dependent on external conditions that are constantly changing. True freedom arises not from controlling life, but from understanding your relationship to it. It is the freedom to experience without fear, act without compulsion, love without possession, exist without needing to justify your existence. It is the freedom of being rather than becoming. This freedom is subtle and profound. It is not loud or dramatic. It emerges quietly when the ego's boundaries dissolve. It fills you like air fills the lungs, not through effort, but through openness. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of this journey is the shift in perception. You begin to see that separation is not a fundamental feature of reality, but a mental construct. Your senses reveal interconnectedness everywhere, interdependence, reciprocity, unity. You notice that the boundary between self and world is permeable. Sensations arise at the interface of inner and outer. Perception happens in a space where the observer and the observed are inseparable. Consciousness is not confined within the skull. It is the field in which all experience appears. This realization is not mystical. It is experiential. It comes from observing the nature of awareness directly, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. With all the layers of ego peeled back, what remains is simplicity, pure presence, free from the burden of self-interpretation. This presence is the source of clarity, compassion, creativity, and peace. It is not something you attain, it is something you uncover. Beneath the noise of thought, beneath the drama of emotion, beneath the tension of resistance, there is a quiet, steady awareness that has been present your entire life. It does not grow old. It does not change with circumstance. It does not fear. It simply is. And in recognizing this, you return home. As this exploration comes to an end, something subtle becomes clear. The journey beyond the ego was never about defeating it, escaping it, or rising above it. It was about seeing it clearly, seeing its stories, its boundaries, its fears, and recognizing that none of them have ever been able to define the fullness of who you are. Life continues to move, unchanged in its motion, yet transformed in your perception. The waves continue to rise and fall, the heart continues to open and close, and thoughts continue to appear and dissolve. But now, there is space around everything. A quiet space, a natural space, a space where awareness rests without effort. In that space you find yourself returning to something simple, something familiar, something that has been with you from the beginning, the stillness behind all experience. This stillness does not push or pull. It does not judge or compare. It does not ask you to be anything other than what you already are. It simply remains calm, steady, and endlessly present no matter what rises and falls within it. To live from this stillness is not to withdraw from the world, but to meet the world without the weight of illusion. It is to act without the tension of identity, to speak without the armor of separation, to feel without the fear of being overwhelmed. It is to move lightly through life, knowing that every moment is part of a much larger unfolding, and that you yourself are woven into that unfolding in ways the ego could never comprehend. So, as you step away from this reflection, carry with you not a conclusion, but a gentle reminder. You are more than the stories the ego tells. You are more than the beliefs you inherited, the fears you absorbed, or the boundaries you were taught to defend. You are the awareness in which all of this appears. You are the space in which life flows freely. You are the stillness that cannot be grasped, defined, or contained. Let this realization settle quietly within you. Let it shape the next breath, the next step, the next moment of your life. Not as a philosophy to remember, but as a simple truth to live from. You are not separate. You never were. And in this timeless connection, you are already whole.